Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Baker, and I work as the Environmental Affairs Director for Rolls-Royce North America, based in Washington, D.C. And as part of my roles and responsibilities, I'm responsible for coordinating Rolls-Royce's response to emerging regulation and legislation in the U.S. field. Before I go any further, I'd just like to thank everybody that's been involved in setting up today's session. These things do not happen by chance. There's a lot of hard work that goes on behind the scenes. So I just want to say on behalf of everybody, thank you to everyone that was involved in setting this up and making it possible. I think we had some great discussion this morning, and this afternoon we're going to move on to talk about the interlinked concepts of transport and the environment. We've got two great speakers here this afternoon, which I'm really looking forward to. And in the same way that we did this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to have both speakers speak, and then we're going to have questions after that. In terms of our first speaker, Dominic Marcellino, he's a fellow at the Ecologic Institute in Washington, D.C. Previously, he worked on the research and coordination of InStream, project looking to combine traditional economic indicators with sustainable development objectives at Ecologic Berlin. His research and policy interests include EU-U.S. relations and cooperation, international environmental policy, international climate change policy, with a special focus on emissions trading systems, the economics of climate change mitigation and adaptation, EU and US energy and climate change policy, and the tension between energy and climate policy. And this afternoon, Dominic's going to talk to us about trends in EU energy and climate change policy. And as with this morning, we'll ask Dominic to share his thoughts for the next 20, maybe 25 minutes or so if we need that. We've got a little bit of slack in the schedule. And I'd like to welcome Dominic to the stage.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks also to the organizers. I appreciate the invitation to speak at an event for Indiana University because my mother is actually an alum. She graduated with a master's degree in special education in 1973. So it's only fitting, I guess, that 36 years later that I would come here and give a talk. I realized when listening to the talks earlier today that I think I bit off a little more than I could handle in terms of the topic. By doing both energy and climate change policy. I think that there's no way that I could do justice to either one of them in 20 minutes, and so I do hope that you bear with me that it's going to be an attempt to be very broad as opposed to going deep down into any specific thing, and if you have particular questions, hopefully we can talk about them later. Go to the next slide. I divided my talk into 4 separate sections. The first 2 sections I actually in many ways are really just one, but I think it's important to handle energy policy and climate change policy separately because for a long time in the EU and still in the United States, they were considered very separate things, even though today, especially in the EU, they are looked at as being very interlinked, and some of the main policies that the EU has right now draw that link very directly. So that'll be the first 2 sections will be energy policy, and then I'll draw a couple trends that I see in both energy and climate change policy together, and in the final section I'll try to elaborate on a couple takeaways for Indiana because we're here. It's important to try to do that. EU energy policy has 3 pillars. The first is energy security. The second is sustainable development. And actually, if you could stay on that slide. Sorry, I cut down the number of slides because I don't really like PowerPoint, so I only use pictures when necessary. In addition to sustainable development and energy security, the third is economic competitiveness. And throughout the last 3 or 4 decades, one of those 3 pillars had prominence over the others. In the 70s, in response to the oil shocks, energy security was actually sort of the focus of energy policy. In the 80s and early 90s, economic competitiveness was a big deal because you looked at deregulating the energy markets, electricity and gas. And starting in the mid-90s, actually there was a bigger concern for the environment, especially climate change, which is a big driver of energy policy. But in the energy policy that the EU has, these other 2 pillars haven't been forgotten. Energy security is still massively important. I think anybody that read about the fact that Sofia in Bulgaria had no gas in January, and one of the coldest Januaries they've had in years, as a direct result of energy policy is pushing towards this common approach for all 27 nations, and if it expands further, there really needs to be a common approach not only toward in dealing with energy security, but also with climate change and creating jobs and growth in the economic competitive context. Next slide. One thing that's important to note is that the United States and the EU actually share a lot of commonalities. We see here in this pie graph that in terms of primary energy consumption, the proportions divided between the main sections of energy are actually pretty similar. You have almost the exact same proportion of energy coming from oil, really similar proportions from coal and nuclear, renewables, natural gas. In fact, the graphs look very similar. You have similar discussions about energy security as well, except there's a couple of dynamics that are changed. In Russia, or in the EU, if you substitute Russia for Saudi Arabia and natural gas for oil and pipelines for tankers, you actually have similar discussions of energy security in the EU and in the United States. But to get back to the issue of energy itself, the EU also is a better user of energy than the United States. It has a bigger economy. It has more people, but they use less energy in an absolute sense than the United States. So the per capita energy usage is much lower. And for climate change, that's a big deal because, as you see, the vast majority of energy in both groups comes from fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. And so the fact that we use more energy in the United States means that we have higher emissions, almost roughly twice as high as the EU does. And so what that points out to is opportunities to be better, because no one would say that the Europeans are living some sort of hardship life. I had the opportunity to live in Germany for 3 years, and I can tell you it's about as cushy as living in the United States. So there really is, there's areas to improve our energy usage that don't even sacrifice some of the things that we've come to expect. For Indiana, I think it's important to look at the fact that these graphs actually are sort of, these are cumulative use of energy. Indiana's mix is actually very similar to Poland's, in fact. The majority of energy comes from coal, and then there's a significant portion that goes to oil and natural gas. And what that points out is that different states in the United States and different countries in the EU face different challenges when we talk about energy. And they have different opinions about how energy security should be dealt with. And that actually plays an interesting role when making decisions about energy policy. If you go to the next slide. Oh, actually, sorry. I really got, if you go back 2 more. I'll say a couple things about the EU energy policy going forward. They have an emphasis on infrastructure development, and the reason that is I mentioned earlier this instance of Bulgaria and the natural gas pipelines going through the Ukraine. The strategic stranglehold that the Ukraine and Russia have over natural gas imports in the EU is forcing them to think about other means of getting gas. They're thinking about building, and already are building, liquefied natural gas terminals. They're looking at building a number of different pipelines to tap gas resources from other parts of the world so they're not dependent on Russia and Ukraine for all of their gas. This is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be cheap, but it is definitely something that they're trying to do. There's also discussions for figuring out how to get massive amounts of solar power from Northern Africa and from the Middle East to the EU. In addition to infrastructure, one of the other things that helps both energy security and climate change is a focus on indigenous resources. The EU is not as endowed with resources as the United States is in terms of natural resources. But what it does have the opportunity to do is invest, and they're doing this already, is a focus on energy efficiency, so getting even more efficient with the energy that they're using. Renewable energy, we see that some of the leaders in the world in terms of instituting policies that promote renewable energy are in Europe. Amazingly, Germany, which is, I think, the latitude of some parts of Canada, actually produces the most electricity from solar power in the whole world, which seems unfathomable. Having been there, it's cloudy most of the time, so I don't really actually know how that's possible, except for the fact that they have solar power everywhere. And a third component of EU policies right now is a focus on technology development. The technologies that exist right now need to be implemented and expanded, but new technologies are going to be necessary in order to meet the challenges of economic growth, of energy security, and of climate change, which then leads very nicely into the next section, which is EU climate change policy. climate change policy has been the main driver of energy policy, as I've mentioned, but why is climate change policy such a big deal for the EU? There's actually a long history of EU consideration of climate change policy. And I think it really is best illustrated by taking a look at what's happened internationally over the last 15 to 20 years. If you can go to the next slide. The EU has been very active in all of the international negotiations, and I've highlighted the 5 main UN negotiating sessions that have happened or are going to happen. And I'll give you just a brief rundown that probably many of you are familiar with already, but it's important to put in context how the EU's approach to climate policy at the international level has changed. In 1992, after the EU had instituted its first domestic climate change policy, which was an energy efficiency measure, they went to Rio de Janeiro for the Earth Summit in an attempt to create binding targets for the world to address climate change. They were inspired by the science and motivated to do something and thought, we'll get everybody together in the UN context and we'll get some binding targets and we'll have a deal. And there were no binding targets in the UNFCCC agreement. And lo and behold, nobody did anything. There were no reductions, and it was clear that something had to change. But what didn't change from the EU's perspective when they got together to come up with binding targets in 1997 was the focus on binding targets. They were not interested in the flexible mechanisms that the United States was proposing. They were adamantly opposed to the cap and trade provision that's in the Kyoto Protocol. But what you've seen after the EU tried to implement its climate change policies is an understanding that they needed a broad policy mix to actually raise to the level of, to raise to the challenge of climate change, and that now includes the use of a cap and trade policy. And I think if you were to have told a European in 1997 that not only would the EU have a cap and trade system in 2005, it would be the first country to have, or the first block of countries to have a cap and trade policy, they either would have laughed at you because it would have been a good joke, or they would have been actually very angry because the objections that they had to climate change policy weren't just on the policy level, they were actually ethical and moral objections to them, which have changed over time when they actually looked at the issues themselves. So to the next slide, in Kyoto, actually if you go back one, I'll mention something really quickly. So Kyoto was agreed in 97. The rules for implementing Kyoto came in 2001, but there was no ratification of the agreement until 2004 because, as mentioned earlier, the United States stayed out. And it wasn't until Russia was convinced, I think, through support for its ascension to the WTO by the EU, that they agreed to ratify the protocol and have now actually done nothing with it. In fact, don't even seem interested in being in the WTO anymore, which is kind of interesting. But what it did do is allow the protocol to move forward. But the protocol was only for a specific amount of time, 2008 to 2012, and at a certain point people realized we have to have some agreement that goes after that. And so in 2007, during the UN meeting in Bali, a 2-year roadmap for coming to an agreement was started, and this will end officially in December of this year in Copenhagen. But I'll talk a little bit more about whether or not there's going to be an agreement on a follow-on agreement in Copenhagen, and sort of prospects for where that will go afterwards. So if you go to the next slide. In Kyoto, the EU committed to an 8% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but that was for the whole EU, and it was actually divided up very differently between the different countries based on the ability to reduce and different economic circumstances. For example, Denmark and Germany had very large reduction targets, and certain countries like Spain, Portugal, and Greece were allowed to increase their emissions, but the overall reduction was supposed to be 8%. They had this goal and they knew that they needed policies, and so they began a process of creating a climate change program to address them. The first program came out in 2001 and had a series of measures and policies to begin reducing emissions, and what actually happened was they realized that they needed more than simply saying X facility will reduce this much and that's where we'll get to our goals. Nobody was doing anything, and so in consideration of the second climate change program, they incorporated a cap and trade policy, and I've included a little neat graphic about how cap and trade works. And actually, briefly mention what it is you have an overall limit on emissions, and that's where you get your 10 little plumes of pollution. And the business on the right can cheaply reduce its emissions and sells its excess allowances to the country or to the business on the left. But the total amount of pollution is kept at this particular level. And the reason that the EU chose climate change or cap and trade policy was flexibility and for cost containment, because what you have is a situation where nobody knows how much it costs for each individual business to reduce its emissions. And in fact, some businesses can do it very cheaply, and for other businesses it's very expensive. So having a policy that allows flexibility, not only can you achieve your environmental goal, but you actually can do it in a cheaper way. Just quick statistics about the cap and trade system in the EU. Approximately 12,000 entities are covered, and the market transactions on the market, this trading of money for allowances is going to reach about $100 billion this year. And so it is not a small market, and it's not something that should be neglected. In addition to the cap and trade policy, other individual countries set up different policies to achieve some of their goals. I'll mention one because it'll be a good example for later. Germany set up what's called a feed-in tariff to promote the introduction of renewable energies. And what they did was set out a payment plan above market rates for those who would install solar, wind, and a host of other renewable energies. And that payment would be given to them for every kilowatt hour that they produced. It's not a production tax credit or how renewable energy is often rewarded in the United States, where you get to sell the excess at market rates, but you have to buy what you use at market rates as well. In fact, what you have is above market rates paid for all electricity, and then whatever electricity that you use is you can then buy at the wholesale rate. So you had policy security as well as an ability to plan ahead and realize what your returns were going to be if you made some of these investments. And the policy in Germany has been wildly successful, has been a big job creator. The German government estimates that something like 250,000 jobs have been created through this feed-in tariff. Another measure that they have, an ecological tax, has produced over 100,000 jobs. So on the whole, this climate policy has been a net benefit for jobs in Germany and in other places as well. So the discussion of climate change is intricately linked with energy, and so the EU realized that and memorialized this fact in what's called their climate and energy package, which had two main goals. It was initiated in 2007 and finalized earlier this year. In terms of the commitments that the EU made, they are willing, what they said unilaterally is that they would reduce their emissions by 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. They would derive 20% of their energy from renewables, and they would also institute a 20% increase in efficiency. The reason that this is noteworthy is, one, it formally integrated both policies together, but secondly, it was the EU's announcement to the rest of the world about what it was willing to do with or without climate change agreement and Copenhagen. In addition to the 20% reduction, they said, if other developed countries are willing to meet us along this way and commit to comparable efforts, we actually not only will do 20%, we'll bump that up to 30% as a carrot to bring other countries together in Copenhagen to reach a deal. The next slide. So that brings me to some trends that I see in energy and climate change policy. The first trend is clearly the convergence. If you go to the next slide. There's a clear convergence towards policies as well as the need for centralization to make certain decisions. 27 nations deciding on their own what their climate commitments are going to be made sense inside of the umbrella of the EU, but the decision about what the overall budget was going to be needed to be made at the European Commission level to avoid certain problems of free riders, etc. But this also this also is the case with regards to energy security. For the longest time, countries in the western part of Europe had certain types of policies and got their energy from certain places and didn't really care about what was going on in the eastern part of Europe, where they had different issues, that they were more dependent on Russian gas and had fewer options. And this actually really changed in the past couple of years. But again, this past January, now the second time that Russia and Ukraine in the last 3 years have shut the gas down, or at least threatened to do that, I think has galvanized especially Eastern Europeans, but all Europeans, to think about energy policy, and it really needs to be done in a coordinated way. Some of the policies that can be used, of course, happen to be useful for both energy and for climate change. Renewable energy and energy efficiency are clearly two of those. I think something interesting to watch as the new European Commission is formed this November is whether or not there's any discussion of combining energy and climate issues together into one Directorate General. Right now they're separate, but there's precedence in the member state level for this happening. Last year, the UK combined energy and climate into one ministry, leaving other environment issues aside and in a separate ministry. And we also have precedents in Denmark and Sweden for doing the same thing. And if with the overarching energy and climate package in place, it makes sense theoretically to have a DG energy environment, and be interesting to see if that happens. The second trend, next slide. Whoop. The second trend is a move in the EU to consider using other types of policies, or expanding the policy toolbox, if you will. As I said, no one in the EU thought about using cap and trade, or maybe the English might have, or some of the Scandinavians, but as an overall level, no one thought about using cap and trade when Kyoto was negotiated. But they went ahead and did that, and have used other flexible mechanisms in order to try to achieve goals. I think I'll mention one unsuccessful attempt to use flexibility in order to achieving a goal, which was a voluntary agreement with automakers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or really an efficiency standard with automakers that was supposed to help reduce emissions from the transportation sector. And I have a feeling that Marti will address some of that later. This proved unsuccessful. The automakers didn't improve their efficiency, and the EU actually had to formalize regulations to force the efficiency improvements. But these were watered down by negotiations with the auto industry. But regardless, there's now a hard and fast regulation. The third trend, and the next slide, is clearly the fact that climate change has risen to the level of high politics. It's not your everyday environmental issue, and I think that's because it has cross-cutting interests for development, for energy policy, and looking further down the road, climate change impacts are going to affect food security, water security, and a number of other issues. And there's just simply no way that climate change doesn't rise to the level of some of the other major political issues. And just to give you an idea of how many high-level meetings have taken place in 2009 in order to reach an agreement in Copenhagen, I've included these little arrows, and I think it's 12 on top of all kinds of informal sessions. And I actually just heard President Obama speaking in Cambridge talking about climate change and energy policy, and how the U.S. was going to lead the world in innovation. It'll be interesting to see if he abides by a story that I was told, that when he was in Copenhagen to lobby for the Olympics, someone had a sign that said "Right city, wrong month," and I'm interested to see if he's going to show up in Copenhagen in December in order to try to reach a deal. If nothing else, what this points out is that there is a clear commitment to trying to reach a deal, and certainly failure wouldn't be for a lack of meetings, because there clearly have been a lot of them this year. But what does all this mean for Indiana? I have a couple takeaways. If I had more time, or if I literally had more time, I would probably come up with a few more. But I have three main takeaways for Indiana. The first one is the fact. I guess say it one more time. Yeah. If we're going to do energy policy right, if we're going to take advantage of the fact that Indiana is a manufacturing state that has good renewable energy resources, if it were to exploit them, not only is integration of policy in Indiana important, but also federal policy is important. And it's going to have to be more than having production tax credits that expire every couple of years, but sustained commitment through policy over a long period of time to take advantage of these opportunities. I think that this is inevitable. It's kind of happening, but if Indiana is going to take advantage of this, it needs to be proactive. It needs to have energy and climate policy that's integrated, and it can't actually wait just for federal legislation to put it. I think even if you don't believe in climate change, carbon constrained, or at least an energy constrained world is going to be a fact, and so getting ahead of the curve is an advantage. I'll just mention one reason why having centralized decision making is going to be important. Right now we have enough problems between public utility commissions in one state and another state. Imagine trying to run high voltage transmission lines from an enormous wind farm park in North Dakota to Chicago. How many states do you go through? Who wants a high voltage transmission line in their backyard? How do you connect it to the grid? All of these decisions right now would be made on a state-by-state level, and you'd have to have agreements between states to make this happen. That will delay the process of doing these things by decades if it even allows them to ever happen, if you could even reach deals. Without at least some federal intervention in order to expedite these processes, we're really going to squander an opportunity to remake our energy economy to take advantage of the synergies between energy and climate policy. The second trend, or the second takeaway, is there are lessons to be learned. The EU has been at regulating climate change policy for several years, almost a decade. We are a little bit farther behind, but not so far behind that we can't actually learn and apply lessons right away. And so a dialogue like this, or business-to-business dialogues about, what does it mean to be a regulated entity under a cap-and-trade system? It's probably a lot like being regulated under the cap-and-trade systems that exist in the United States right now for sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide. But those are actually only a few power plants instead of the thousands of facilities that are going to be regulated. The nice thing is that there shouldn't be any additional regulatory burden in terms of facilities being regulated. I believe that the way that the laws are going to be written in the United States, that if you don't already have a regulatory burden under the Clean Air Act, you're not going to have a new burden, but those entities that are regulated under the Clean Air Act, I think are eligible to then have to take part in the EU or in the U.S. cap-and-trade system. But that isn't the only type of policy that we can learn from. The feed-in tariffs from Germany are a great example of another type of policy. A lot of states like Texas use a renewable portfolio standard that says 20% or 15% or 5,000 megawatts have to come from renewable energy. But the feed-in tariff has proven in Europe to be a faster way of scaling up renewable energy. And so that's something that we can learn from. And that feeds into actually my third takeaway, which is that climate policy actually can be an opportunity, and it isn't necessarily a job killer. I talked about the creation of jobs in Germany earlier, 250,000 from the renewable energy policy, 100,000 from tax policy. I'm sure that there were jobs lost, but the net effect has been positive job growth, and this was with higher energy prices, and Germany at the same time was becoming an ever-increasing exporter of goods around the world, and they like to brag about how they were the world champions of exports, and this was happening while they had climate change policy. Energy infrastructure and energy development is a growth industry. Even if you didn't do anything about climate change, there's the needs in the EU alone are $1 trillion because that's a number that we can be sure of. I don't know what the dollar is going to be worth in a number of years, but €1 trillion between now and 2030 for just energy infrastructure investment, and you have similar amounts in the United States, if not more. And then you think about expanding that around the world. There's big opportunities here, and I'll mention a statistic about Indiana. There's already 1,200 entities that are in the clean tech sector that are dealing with renewable energy and energy efficiency, and they employ 17,000 people, and that's without climate change policy and integrated energy policy here. And I think that there's only room for that to grow if those are to be integrated. Thanks very much.